Hi, I'm Josh McGrath,
I'm Andrew Haas.
and this is the Art in Pursuit podcast. I want to start today with a question. Why do so many relationships start off hopeful but end in breakup and heartache? While dating, it's common to resist the input of authority and accountability, or friends and family who raise concerns about the person you're seeing. Sometimes, you might even see those concerns yourself, and sadly, you ignore them.
And too often, those ignored warnings surface later in marriage, revealing compromises made along the way. We know nearly half of marriages end in divorce, not because couples didn't truly love each other when they said "I do," but because their connection was built more on emotional attraction rather than shared values and lasting principles. With marriage, you'll have pressure and conflict, which reveal true character and magnify the consequence of those early choices. And it is the values and principles that each of you possess that will ultimately help you sustain those moments in seasons of pressure.
So today we're talking about how establishing clear biblical values and principles during dating can strengthen you and your relationship, and how this will enable you to withstand the pressures that marriage inevitably brings. As always, don't forget to subscribe to the show. You can watch the video on YouTube or listen with Apple Podcasts or Spotify, and share it with your friends, because changing dating culture starts with changing the conversation. So, Andrew, I think that there are two main reasons that people tend to compromise on their standards. The first is getting to a goal. So this is like a desire for marriage, an eagerness to be married, or in some cases, even a desperation to be married. And unfortunately, when marriage is the goal, what happens is you tend to compromise in order to get to that goal. And the second reason is driven by your emotion that inevitably comes out as part of pursuing someone romantically. It's being in love, so to speak. It's the sexual attraction. It's the emotional intimacy. And when you're emotionally engaged on that level, it's very easy to begin to compromise in order to satisfy that emotional connection.
And most people don't start out a relationship with the intent to compromise.
For sure.
So many people end up compromising somewhere along the way, not for obvious reasons. I mean, sometimes it is, but often it's actually for unintentional reasons.
Yeah, nobody's starting out a relationship thinking, I want to compromise. Most, if not everyone, starts out a relationship with the hope and the expectation that it's going to be successful and hopefully endure.
But, if challenges come up, or if things don't play out as expected, or, strong desires start to come into play, all of a sudden we can end up compromising without even realizing it.
And for Christians, it's easy to begin to think that compromise is actually a form of, love covering a multitude of sins. And it's so important for Christians to recognize that compromising is not a form of love covering a multitude of sins, particularly when we're talking about the dating phase. It's important for men to observe and to act on their convictions, on their values, and on their principles, not compromising that for the sake of maintaining a relationship.
And when we say that we compromise, it's not necessarily talking about a line that we cross.
Sure.
Now, it could be, and it often is, but also what's going on here is that people can start out in a great place, and over time, they could drift to a place where, some people might call it a bad situation. And how does that happen? Well, they are either headed that direction in isolation, meaning they don't have authority and accountability checking in on them. They don't have peers checking in on them. We have tunnel vision, we have blind spots. And without other people looking in and bringing things to our attention, that's often where compromise can happen. It's this drift to a place where we find ourselves and we're like, wait, how did I get here?
That's so true. And that's one of the reasons why we harp on the importance of men having authority and accountability in their life, why it's important for men to have a brotherhood, other men who walk alongside them and know them. Now, a few examples here for our listeners, because we want to make sure that this is tangible and that people can relate to it. One example, I want someone who actively participates in church and values their relationship with God. Turns into the unintentional compromise of dating someone who is indifferent toward Jesus or regularly attending church, thinking you can inspire change over time. It's easy to start out with, we've talked about this again before on the show, an aspirational vision, idea for what a relationship's going to look like. And then as you begin to pursue that woman, you know, there's an attraction element, there's a desire element, and that can very quickly begin to change your perspective, and the values that you have suddenly are compromised because you're thinking, I mean, it is a value, but I think we can figure that out later, or I'm going to help her develop that over time, versus sticking, you know, strongly to those convictions, to those values, to those principles.
Yeah, too often people will start out with these ideas that are, you know, say, these ideas are very important to me, to any relationship that I get into. These things need to be a part of it. And what happens is we get into a relationship and all of a sudden, you know, we have either our desires or our preferences, and we're willing to make excuses or accommodations or, well, not a big deal. And before you know it, we actually find ourselves in a place where, had we known we would have been there earlier, we would have been like, what is going on? Now, another example would be people who will say no sex till marriage. The unintentional compromise would be gradually allowing boundaries to shift, thinking each time, it's not that big of a deal, or we're probably going to get married anyway.
And that happens, unfortunately, all too often, particularly for Bible-believing Christians. A final example that I just want to highlight here, because I think it's really important to make these as tangible as possible, is this idea of, well, my relationship will involve mentors and, you know, authority and accountability. And the unintentional compromise becomes entering a relationship and gradually isolating yourselves, thinking accountability can come later or really isn't necessary. They just don't understand us. I mean, how many couples does that very notion highlight?
Now, it's important to note that the goal of the dating phase is to evaluate the other person.
Absolutely.
You know, you're looking for things like character, value, quality, ability, compatibility of the other person. And too often when people are dating, there's this tendency to say excuse or ignore, say, you know, problematic areas, problematic tendencies. But I promise you that within marriage, there will be plenty of opportunities to cover a multitude of sins. There will be shortcomings, there will be failures, and that is the place to practice loving the other person and not necessarily making a big deal out of those things. But during the dating phase, it actually can be appropriate to make a big deal out of them.
I love that. Let's talk now about this idea of understanding the difference between values versus preferences and principles versus wants. Let's define values this way. Deeply held beliefs about what you consider most important, right, or meaningful in life that represent who you are and what you stand for. Everyone has a set of values of some kind. What informs those values may be different from person to person. The values themselves perhaps are different from person to person. But for the Christian, our values are formed predominantly by the Bible. Now, everyone has preferences, and we're defining preferences this way: personal tastes or things you prefer. Everybody has personal preferences. Everyone has things that they prefer. And when it comes to a romantic relationship, when it comes to pursuing someone romantically, obviously, almost every human in the world probably has a preference of things they're looking for in another person. However, when it comes to your personal taste, the things you would like to have, the things you would like to see in the other person, you might need to compromise on those preferences. But when it comes to the values that drive your life, the values that you're looking to be instilled to exist in the person you're pursuing, you should never compromise on those.
It is really good practice to learn to distinguish between values and preferences, just like it is very important to distinguish between principles versus wants. Now, what are principles? They're fixed guidelines or standards that drive your choices and behaviors. And we're describing wants this way: things you'll choose because they're convenient. So as men are walking this out, it is very important to put in the time, put in the effort to really figure out what is a value, what is a preference, what are the principles, and what are the wants. Find out where that line is and be ready and willing to not compromise, to not change on the values and principles. The other things can change, and they will change.
Yep.
And we know that, a year into marriage, 5 years, 30 years in, things are going to look very different than they did in the beginning. And that's natural, and that's how it's supposed to be. So there will be change, but not everything will change.
One of the dangers of not having authority and accountability in your life, particularly as a man, is that we are often going to choose the path of least resistance. And when it comes to, preferences and wants, that oftentimes is the path of least resistance. It's the thing that's easiest to go after. It's so much harder to maintain integrity, to maintain your values, to maintain your principles when there's a draw on you for something that you want. And we've unpacked this many times before on the podcast, but when it comes to romantic pursuits, there's a sexual draw, there's an intimacy draw, there's an emotional draw, there's the way of a woman with a man draw. And so for men, without setting up guardrails, without being intentional to value the things that are lasting, they will oftentimes just compromise. And it's not even, like we said, it's not even intentional. It's not I want to go out and compromise. The principles and wants are the path of least resistance. And so for our listeners, for all men, prior to starting a relationship, they need to know what are their values and principles. If men aren't sure what their own values and principles are, they're never going to be able to see them in another person. The only way you're going to see those values and principles is if you yourself know what they are in your own life.
And if you call yourself a Christian, your faith in Jesus and what the Bible says must dictate your values and principles. Because, think about it. If that's not the case, then what is your faith for?
Yeah.
If it's not an integral part of your life that is providing direction and boundaries and structure, then why have it if it's just something that can be ignored or set aside?
Our faith in Jesus should force us to ask the question, how then shall I live in light of what Christ has done for me? And sadly, today, so many Christians will push back on applying biblical wisdom and principles to a dating relationship or to a romantic relationship at all because they don't like the way that it feels. They don't like either the constraints or the definitions or the way that it's supposed to be walked out. And I'm like, don't look to the world to define for you what a healthy relationship is. Why would you look to the very thing that is broken and needs to be redeemed as the definition of what is good, right, and holy? Look to the author and finisher of our faith, Jesus Christ. Look to him to define for you what pursuing a romantic relationship looks like, to define what a romantic relationship should entail, to define what marriage is and should look like for you.
Matthew 7 has this great parable about two homes. One was built on sand and one was built on rock. And we're not going to claim this to be Bible, but there's a parallel here with that parable in dating. You can build a relationship off of things like desires, feelings, emotion. And in time, all of those things are going to shift and change. Whereas if you build your relationship off of something much stronger, convictions, faith, principles, that's going to really give you the strong foundation that's going to carry you through time.
I love that because what you're saying here is not that you can't build a structure on the sand. Because in that parable, one of the things that Jesus shares is that when the storm came, the house that was built on the sand collapsed.
Right.
And what you're highlighting is that you absolutely can build a relationship on those temporal, the emotions, the desires, the attraction, you can build a relationship on that. But the storm will inevitably come. And when it does, that house is going to come crashing down. That relationship is going to come crashing down, which is why we see such a fast rate of turnover in relationships. Why, everyone and their neighbor seems to have dated, a dozen plus times and has a line of exes in their past. But like Jesus said with regards to our faith in Christ, if we build that on the rock, when the storm comes, the house remains standing. And the parallel here being that in a romantic relationship, if you build a relationship on those, what you mentioned, values, principles, convictions, faith, if you build a relationship on that, it's not saying that the storm isn't going to come. Everyone's going to be hit by the storm. But what will happen is you'll find that your relationship endures. The storm comes and that the relationship is still standing. And that is, I think, a brilliant analogy to use when it comes to, the pursuit of a romantic relationship.
And I think that is a great thing to just highlight, that you can build a relationship on something and it could look great for 6 months, for a year, 5 years. And that's not the point. The point isn't to build something that looks great. The point is to build something that's long lasting.
Yeah.
And that's only going to happen if the foundation is solid.
One of the things that I've heard said all too often, whether it's with people in my own life that are pursuing romantic relationships or just culturally, is that they're disappointed when I'm not happy for them in their romantic pursuits. When I express concern, when I express, hey, I actually don't think this is good for you, or I don't think this is healthy for you. Here are the situations I think you should consider changing. And I've had close friends over the years say, if you were really my friend, you'd be happy for me. I've had Christian people tell me that. I've also had Christian friends who, when I brought concerns to them, that kind of ended our friendship because they were like, well, the fact that you don't think, she's great and she's the best person in the world, what do you know? And then down the road, they're not even serving Jesus. And I've said this before. I don't know what will work, but I know what won't work. And what won't work is you pursuing your happiness. If your relationship is about your happiness, it's a relationship that will not last, and inevitably you will not be happy. Like you said, there might be a season and a time and a moment where you are happy, where you are fulfilled, where you think love is bliss and it's never going to end. But one of the things that as you become older, as you become more mature, is you understand the reality that at some point, difficulty is going to set in. And all of those emotions, all of those, intimate moments that you're experiencing, it's fleeting. And when hardship comes, the only thing that's going to help you endure is something that has value, conviction, principles, faith. It is those things that will sustain you through those storms.
Somehow this cultural dynamic crept in where the person alone gets to determine what is good and healthy for them, for the relationship.
That's true.
And somehow it became unfashionable to offer insight or advice to people. And that's kind of the drum that we beat here. It's like, stay open. Don't think that I'm the only one that can decide whether this is a good thing.
Yeah. It's so true because we just as humans tend to be very temporal in our thinking. Even as Christians, sadly, we too often just think about the here and now and not about eternity. And we're unaware oftentimes of consequences, good or bad. Consequences aren't simply bad. Consequences are the result of our actions. And all too often when people are pursuing romantic relationships, when men go after a woman, they will not be thinking about how their actions, how their behaviors, what they do, what they say may have either good or bad consequences down the road. And so too often, one of the things that we observe, we see, we've even experienced in our own friend circles are men who pursue women in a way that is not healthy, in a way that is not wise, it ends up in marriage, and then sadly, it ends in divorce. And it's easy to lay blame on the woman or the environment or the situation or the timing. But in reality, the blame is on the man not taking responsibility from day one to involve authority and accountability, to walk in wisdom. You know, James talks about that. If anyone lacks wisdom, let him ask, and he shall receive from the Lord. We lack wisdom. All of us lack wisdom. But God is faithful, and that if we are willing to ask him for wisdom, he will give it. Doesn't mean we're going to like it, but he's willing to give it. And it oftentimes comes in the form of authority, accountability.
Marriage is too important and it's too big of a deal to risk compromising on your values and principles. There's this great quote by a pastor. Basically, it's that if you have a strong marriage, you can go out, your community can be weak, your environment can be weak, and you'll go out in strength. You will be strong. Conversely, if your marriage is weak, it doesn't matter how strong your community is, it doesn't matter how strong your environment is, you won't live life with strength. Marriage is so important and so formidable that it really is worth putting in the time and effort to figure these things out.
And for the Christian, it's so important to remember that marriage is actually a representation of Christ and his relationship to his bride, the church. Where people will often go wrong is they believe that marriage is the destination. It's the place where they have to end up or want to end up. But in reality, marriage is actually just another tool to be used to build the kingdom and to be a light in a very dark and broken world, to reflect who Christ is and his relationship and love for his church.
And if you end up having kids someday, these things are so important because this is what will be modeled to them. And if that day comes, you want these things to be well rehearsed, well practiced. You want it to be part of who you are, not just something that you put on at that time. Oh, okay, my kids need a good example, or I need to show my kids this. If it's not something that you're familiar with well before you have kids, it's going to be very hard to model that well when kids come along.
And sadly, so many in our generation grew up in a very broken home environment. They're the product of divorce. And so what happens is many of these men and women will go out and they will pursue a romantic relationship, and they will think they're doing it in the right way to avoid the dysfunction that their parents experienced, when in reality, what they're doing is they're just copying the exact same playbook that their parents did. And without even knowing it, if they continue down that line, they're going to end up likely with the same result. The only way that relationships stand a chance is if they're built upon something that's longer lasting than how you feel in that moment. And this is why we're talking about the importance of being aware of consequences. Because if you're just living in the now moment of how you feel about a woman and about a relationship, and that's as big as your vision is, you will compromise as far as the day is long, and you will do things you should never do, which will result in you being in a place you should never be.
And love, companionship, sexual intimacy, these are beautiful, incredible things. Very good to desire them.
Of course.
But they have to be added to a solid foundation. That can't be the foundation. And too many people fail to do that. Either don't recognize it, we talked about that earlier, or they just intentionally ignore it. And it's so important for men to understand the things you desire are probably good, but you have to do things in the right order.
I've heard it put this way: start with the end in mind. In one way that men can think about how they're conducting themselves in the pursuit of a romantic relationship is, if I end up marrying this woman and we end up having kids, will I be proud to tell them the story of how I pursued their mother? Am I ready to tell them all the details because it is child appropriate?
Yeah.
Or is there anything that I'm doing right now that I would be ashamed to admit to them? Because hopefully every man who wants to pursue a woman is conducting himself in a way where he can tell that story after he's married to his kids and to his grandkids. And it's a story that can inspire them in how they can conduct a romantic relationship.
And that reminds me, actually, something that I often do, and this is way oversimplified, but I will often say to myself, okay, if everyone did what I'm doing, would we be better off as a culture, as a community, or would we be worse off? And so too often we excuse our behavior as, well, it's not that bad. But we really should be thinking, if everyone did this, would it be a problem? Or would we actually be better off? And I think that can be a helpful, if oversimplified, way to think about how to approach this well.
I think that's actually a great place to conclude today's conversation. So, gentlemen, the values and principles you establish today are the foundation that will determine whether your future relationship stands strong or crumbles under pressure. Compromise rarely starts as a conscious decision. It creeps in slowly, disguised as chemistry, justified by hope or wrapped in emotion. But when the storm comes, and trust me, it will, the emotional connection won't be enough to hold things together. Only a foundation built on Christ, biblical values and principles will sustain you. So, 2 things we want you to do this week. Number 1, write down your non-negotiables. What are your biblical values? And if you're not a Christian, write down what your values are. What are your principles? Clarify them in writing so they're not vague ideas, but concrete things you actually can articulate. And number 2, share them with authority and accountability. Share your list with authority and accountability. Share it with the men in your life that make up your brotherhood. And ask hard questions like, do you see any ways I've compromised in the past? And can you hold me accountable to these standards going forward? Remember, it is better to stay single than to marry in compromise. As always, we love having you here on the Art in Pursuit podcast, and we look forward to having you here next time with us.